Hi, welcome to Videos from the Ville. I'm Professor Greenawalt, and this is Introduction to Public Administration and Public Service. Um, Today we're going to talk about what is public administration. We're going to define public administration. Uh, what is it? Well, there's no easy definition of public administration because the term public administration has been used four different ways. We find that the term public administration has been used in a general fashion as a field of occupational activity. We find that the term public administration has been used as an academic discipline, as a branch of learning or instruction. We find that the term public administration has been used as a science, as a body of knowledge that's systematically arranged, that shows operations or laws. And we find that public administration has also been used as a profession or as a lifelong career. Now, how do we define profession? Frederick Mosier, one of my mentors at the University of Virginia, who is one of the trio of three major figures in the history of American public administration. Um, Frederick Mosier has always been one of those most famous for his book Democracy in the Public Service. But Frederick Mosier, M-O-S-H-E-R, he defined professions for us. He had a way with words that many of us don't. He defined professions this way. In Democracy in the Public Service, he said that a profession is, quote, a social mechanism whereby knowledge, particularly new knowledge, is translated into action and service. They provide the means whereby intellectual achievement becomes operational. Don't you love that definition? They provide the means whereby intellectual achievement becomes operational. So that is Frederick Mosier's definition of a profession. What are the parts? What are the components of this definition? Well, Mosier would tell you that the components of this definition would, to be a professional means you have a career, number one. So the components of a definition would include, number one, a career, number two, a degree of specialization in the kind of work that's performed, a degree of specialization in the kind of work that's performed. Number three, you'd find that some degree of specialized education is required. Some degree of specialized education. Number four, professional association with the national headquarters. And number five, some degree of altruism. All those components need to be there to be considered a professional. So, as we move to definitions of public administration, we can turn to one of America's finest and foremost public administrators. He actually started his teaching career here at Millersville. He was a graduate of West Point. I believe he was on the track team and the football team. He served his military obligation with the U.S. Army, and then he went to the University of Michigan, where he got his doctorate. And after he got his master's and doctorate at Michigan, he came here. And Michigan is certainly one of the most famous and one of the best schools for political science in America. But here he taught a variety of subjects here, and being public administration and scope and methods, for example, and that's what I took him for. Grover Starling has taught for many, many years at the University of Houston at Clear Lake, where he's head of the Center for Competitiveness, the Center for Competition. Um, and they do much, much work with NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Grover Starling's written, I think, the single best book on public administration that's available, and I used to use it for this class. But every time the book was revised, every time the book was updated, it became much more complicated, if you will, much more in depth. And it got to the point where now I think it is still the best single book on public administration that the Academy has available to it, but that it needs to be used now for graduate school, not undergraduate school. But his book is Managing the Public Sector, and then he wrote a fantastic introduction to American government as well. As we look at Grover Starling, what is his definition of public administration? His definition is that public administration comprises all those activities. Public administration comprises all those activities involved in carrying out the policies of elected officials and some activities associated with the development of those policies. So public administration comprises all those activities involved in carrying out the policies of elected officials and some activities associated with the development of those policies. Again, be well advised to be following this video with your PowerPoints and your PowerPoint presentations that I sent to you. We find that some very great brothers, Felix and Lloyd Nigro, and some of their very excellent books in public administration. They have their own definition of public administration. How do they define it? Felix and Lloyd Nigro define public administration through 5 elements. They say public administration is comprised of the following things, and you can again follow this on your PowerPoints. 1 is a cooperative group effort in a public setting. The cooperative group effort in a public setting. Number 2, it covers all 3 branches of government, executive, legislative, and judicial. Covers all 3 branches of government and their relationships. Number 3, it has an important role in the formulation of public policy, and thus is part of the political process. It has an important role in the formulation of public policy, and is thus part of the political process. Number 4, it's different in significant ways from private administration. It's different in significant ways from private administration. Number 5, it's closely associated with numerous private groups. It's closely associated with numerous private groups and individuals in providing services to the community. So number 5, it's closely associated with numerous private groups and individuals in providing services to the community. Now, another fantastic definition of public administration is given to us by Luther Gulick. Luther Gulick, G-U-L-I-C-K. G-U-L-I-C-K, Luther Gulick. He is another member of the trio of great American public administrators. Frederick Mosher, Luther Gulick, and Dwight Waldo was the third who had been has been with the Syracuse University. Syracuse University, which is considered to have the finest public administration program in America traditionally. But Luther Gulick defines public administration by what it consists of, and he uses an acronym. It's the most famous acronym in American public administration, and that is POSDECORB. POSDECORB. POSDECORB stands for planning. Think of things, verbs that all have to do with public administration. The P is planning. The O is organizing. The S is staffing, which would mean the hiring and firing and evaluation of people. Staffing. The D is directing. We have, I know, a COO, but we're just a CO. The CO is coordinating. The R is reporting, and the B is one of the most important things, budgeting. So Luther Gulick says public administration is POSDECORB. The P is for planning, the O is organizing, the S is for staffing, the D is for directing, the CO for coordinating, the R for reporting, and the B for budgeting. POSDECORB. I hope that all of you will learn that quickly, so I call on anyone in class, you'd be able to recite that immediately. Of course, I can't call on you just in class in the way I traditionally could, can I? Well, does Grover Starling think that public administration could be a science? He says no, he does not think so. Why does he say this? Well, he believes that science developed and science is characterized by something that we refer to as paradigms. Paradigms are conceptual frameworks. The word paradigm was never heard much in society, and then Bill Clinton started to use it a few times, and it became fairly widespread. A paradigm is nothing more than a conceptual framework which tries to explain to explain some phenomena, just to explain some phenomena that we haven't gotten our a full hold on yet. So paradigm, a conceptual framework which explains and interprets phenomena. So how does science develop? And what is it characterized by? We find that Grover Starling doesn't believe that public administration can be a science. And I'll talk about why in just a little bit. But you find that if we are going to look at public administration as a science, we need to define what a science is. And we're working on this. First of all, we are going to turn to Thomas Kuhn, K-U-H-N, K-U-H-N, Thomas Kuhn. He says that science develops and is characterized by paradigms, conceptual frameworks which explain phenomena. This whole idea was developed by Thomas Kuhn in a great book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Kuhn believes that science develops through the presence of anomalies. Anomalies are results from experiments that can't be explained by the accepted paradigm. These are exceptions to the paradigm. And if the number of anomalies grows and grows and grows, pretty soon the paradigm isn't going to be any good anymore, and we'll look for alternatives to that. And so this is how scientific revolutions occur. We find that the paradigms can no longer explain all the anomalies. We can't overlook that. And we find that when a paradigm comes about that can explain many of the anomalies, then we find that we have a scientific revolution. And we have a better explanation than the one we had before. We find that Grover Starling believes that public administration is in a pre-paradigm stage. He believes that it's in a stage where facts, opinions, and hypotheses are circulating, and they haven't been organized, they haven't been connected, and they don't need to be. Grover, does he want public administration to become a science? He says most adamantly, no, no, no. He thinks that public administration is concerned with what? It's concerned with trying to solve public problems. It's trying to improve the public interest, trying to improve the way that all of us live and work every day. So he believes that public administration needs to be concerned with real, pressing, current problems. And the sooner we can solve them, the better. So Grover Starling says if you're a science, then you have to accept paradigms. If you accept paradigms, you limit your questions, for example. So if Starling doesn't want to treat public administration as a science, what does he want to treat it as? Well, he'd like to treat it as a profession. He'd like to treat it as a profession. And then we have other great public administrators such as Berkeley. Berkeley wants to treat public administration, for example, as a craft, Well, how do we talk about public administration? How do we think about it? How do we consider it? We want to realize that the scope of public administration is very, very, very broad. It's impossible to write one book or one book of readings which will cover all aspects of public administration. Because the field of public administration is extraordinarily wide, public administration contains information from political science, information from history, information from economics, information from psychology are all covered by this field of public administration. Well, over the years, we find, too, that the discipline of public administration has certainly broadened, and it's widened, and it's had its boundaries confused. How is that true? What has happened in society to do these things? What has happened in society to widen and confuse the boundaries of public administration? Well, there are 8 different factors. Let me share these with you. There are 8 different factors. Number 1, it's increasingly difficult, as Frederick Mosier would have told you, it's increasingly difficult to separate public and private spheres. We used to know that, the post office was completely public, no doubt about it. And now, over the years, we find that that's not necessarily the case, that now it has been, there's an attempt made to privatize it, but what is still true is that before the post office can change the benefit package for postal employees, change the pay, that they have to get permission from Congress. In order to change the rate for postage, they have to change get the permission of Congress. So the post office is both public and private, isn't it? So it's increasingly difficult to separate the public and private spheres. We find, number 2, the separation of the powers in government has eroded. The separation of the powers in government has eroded. Number 3, the separation of the levels of government has eroded. We find that the separation of the levels of government has eroded. It used to be considered that education was a local government activity. And then under the administration, for example, of George Bush Jr., we find that the Bush administration, under the No Child Left Behind program, they wanted to come into the schools to try to help the local governments and the state governments make sure that all children could read. And now, all of a sudden, local governments and local schools, which had been used to settling their own problems, and that all of a sudden now federal officials were in local education and were trying to be of assistance. So the separation of the levels of government has eroded. Number 4, there used to be a separation in foreign and domestic affairs. That is no longer true. We see that disappearing some time ago. For example, when 1980, we find that the Soviets invade Afghanistan. And what do we do in response? Well, we decide not to go to the Soviet Olympics, and not to go to the Olympics in Moscow, and much of the free world followed suit. Um, you find that um, in response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, that we decided to impose a grain embargo on the Soviet Union, and that affected the farmers. The farmers weren't able to sell their grain to the Soviet Union as they normally could, so they had a glut of grain, and the price of grain went way, way down. So here, as the foreign affairs, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and how it affects the domestic price of wheat in the United States. So this separation of foreign and domestic affairs is no longer as clear as it once was. You find that the dichotomy among government employees has eroded. Now it's harder to tell management from labor than it used to be. The boundaries among the processes of government has eroded. Now if we're planning, we're budgeting. If we're budgeting, we're planning. That wasn't true in the past. You have an erosion between the different activities of government. Um, you find that now to try to discourage young people from engaging in a life of crime. For example, they have been taken into the prison system of New Jersey, and to scare them. I think that program was called Scared Straight. So here you have the Justice Department at a statewide level getting involved with the Educational Department for trying to engage in law enforcement, discouraging young people from engaging in a life of crime. So the erosion of the boundaries between different programs of government, that's disappeared. Well, the similarities, we go to the differences between public and private administration. Similarities are great because administration is a cooperative group effort. A cooperative group effort to solve problems or to attain goals. We find that many schools indeed have a generic many schools have a generic school of administration. We had that at Ferrum College. We didn't have public administration. We didn't have private business administration. We just had a school of administration, and we combined public and private together. But the main distinction between public and private administration is the environment. Starling argues over and over again that the peculiar element in public administration is that everything that a government agency does is in essentially a goldfish bowl. Public officials can be viewed by everybody at any time. So we operate in a goldfish bowl. James Forrestal, you've all heard of the Forrestal class of naval ships, was named for him, being the first Secretary of Defense that we ever had after the Second World War. You had the merger of the Army Department, the Army and the Navy Department, along with the Army Air Force, and the Army Air Force, becomes the Air Force, yes. But James Forrestal is the first person to head up this new department. At first they call it the Department of the Military Establishment. Very awkward name, and so very quickly it takes the name of the Department of Defense. And Jimmy Forrestal was one of the first and one of the brightest people to lead that department, but certainly the first as it becomes the Department of Defense. James Forrestal, and there was a class of ships now that are named for him, Forrestal category of ships. But James Forrestal says, quote, "The difficulty of government work is that it not only has to be done well, but the public has to be convinced that it's being done well. So the difficulty of government work is that it not only has to be done well, but the public has to be convinced that it's being done well. So in other words, there is a necessity both for competence and for exposition. But there is a necessity both for competence and exposition, and he holds it extremely difficult to combine the two in the same person, unquote. And that is indeed why it's very difficult for many businessmen to excel in government, where everyone can see everything, or everyone's supposed to be able to see everything that you do. The difficulty in government work is that it not only has to be done well, you have to do it well, but you have to convince the public that it's being done well as well. So you have to be very good at what you do, and you have to be very good at explaining to the general public what you're doing. So in order to succeed in government, you have to do good work, but you have to convince the public that you're doing good work as well. Well, when we're looking at public and private administration, certainly some differences are the size and the diversity of activities. The government is different from the private sector because there's no private company around that can match the size of the federal government and the diversity of its activities. Government activities are on a much wider scope, and they can affect the entire economic and social structure of the country, such as, for example, it's the Federal Reserve that decides what the interest rate's going to be. The interest rate can affect the whole economy one way or the other. Very different. Public versus private administration, of course, many of us believe that the key difference between public and private administration is simply that government lacks a profit motive. They don't have to work efficiently because they can continue to exist even in the red. They don't need to make a profit. If they're operating at a loss, they can increase taxes, or they can move money from one program over to the other. Well, let's take a break right here, and we'll go on to the history of public administration, which will be next, the history of public